I'm curious a little bit in terms of the history of Chapel. From the early days to today, there's a lot of work and effort going into not just creating a project as open source code base, but also as an open source community. Do you remember how you set up governance for the project at the beginning, for example, and how that evolved?
Yeah, I can talk about that. I'm smiling because we didn't really think about governance for the project until really the past year or so in any significant way. And I realized that to a lot of open source projects, that would be ludicrous. But let me explain a bit more about why. So, initially, as we've talked about, this project came about through this DARPA program that our company was participating in, and it was part of our response to that program. And so there was no doubt in our minds that even though we were creating something that was going to be open source in terms of its releases initially and eventually its development, that it was our project. We're going to do with it what we want and need to do, right? We're in charge. And that attitude has prevailed through most of the project. And I've said it in kind of a jerky way, right? It's not like we were jerks about it. And we would certainly take input, particularly from users, into account. We got a lot of great feedback from users, places we had designed something not as well as we could have or overlooked something. We'd hear that and respond to it. But there was never any doubt in our minds that this is our project and we're going to do with it what we need to. I mentioned that sort of that started to change about a year ago. And, it's probably been, I would say, maybe a little bit more gradual than that. But the thing I'm referring to there is, so a year ago, we decided that we were going to apply to this new foundation. I think you mentioned it before, the High Performance Software Foundation, or HPSF. This is a new foundation that was started up under the Linux Foundation, which of course we were familiar with. And HPSF is all about creating open source software for HPC, for high performance computing, that is has the goals of improving user productivity and growing the community. Things that, as you could tell from our earlier conversation, are very much kind of part and parcel of why we were doing Chapel as well. The other thing I'll refer back to is in that initial conversation with Burton Smith, our chief scientist that I mentioned at the time, we noted that while a lot of successful languages started with a single vendor, the most successful ones ultimately became community efforts or multi-vendor efforts or multiple organization efforts. And so I remember him saying in that conversation, so we need to make sure that we do this at some point, we don't just hang on to it forever. And this is a problem we had wrestled with over time with the community. So I guess you could say this is us wrestling with governance, but we were sort of how do we do that? How do we establish a Chapel Foundation if we wanted to do that? How do we move the governance and ownership of the project outside of Cray at the time, outside of HPE more recently? And we wrestled with it, and we ultimately would say, well, gosh, that's a lot of work. And we'd ask the users, how important is this to you? And they would say, not that important right now. And so we just sort of never got around to it. It's kind of like hosting your own open source project. It sort of felt like a lot of work. And then once HPSF came on the scene, which was probably about a year and a half ago now, I think they sort of officially launched, if I remember correctly. We were oh, well, these are our kindred spirits. Their mission matches our mission. This is probably exactly what we've been looking for as far as not doing it all ourselves and going it alone, but becoming part of this bigger community. And so we applied, I think it was October 1st of last year or something like that. And one of the requirements in applying was you had to point to a bunch of things, one of which was your governance document. And we were well, we don't really have a governance document, but here's loosely how we're governed, which was basically we make the choices, we listen to user input, we put things up on GitHub issues so users can comment on them and weigh in, and then we're going to decide what we're going to decide. And to be very fair to HPSF, they said, well, you really need a governance document, but it's fine that you don't actually have an open governance model yet. That's something we want you to work towards, and that's something we wanted to work towards as well. But mostly you need to have some sort of governance document saying, laying this all out, what you've just explained to us about, practically speaking, how does it work? And so it was only as part of finalizing that application that we put together that we created that. And in fact, I think if I remember correctly, that was the beginning of this calendar year, because it took a while for our application to get processed and get to the top of their stack. And that was one of the first and main pieces of feedback we got. That's kind of how we got to our modern thinking about governance. And as a result of the application process, we have now formed what we call our technical steering committee, which is like a formal voting governing body. It is still largely HPE employees by virtue of the fact that sort of the traditional thing, as I understand it in Linux Foundation projects, is to have everyone with commit privileges have the opportunity to be on that governing body on day one. And when I say commit privileges, I really mean merge privileges in GitHub lingo. So the only people who have merge privileges today are HPE employees from kind of a security safety perspective. So we review all pull requests. And therefore, the initial governing body today is still dominantly HPE. That said, one of the first tasks we are wrestling with as a governing body is, how do we add new people to this? Because we have users and collaborators that we think would be great on this body. But what is the process that they should use to apply? And we want to make sure to set that up fairly so that we're not just sort of letting our friends and family in, but then like we're exclusionary to other people, right? So we want to sort of establish what the process will be and then start putting some of our long-term users and collaborators through it.